tape was bogus. Man, we've been talking about this for years. So how is this the big headline from the report?
We knew that to some degree, but not to the degree we know now. We didn't know that for days. You had Jay Carney on the 14th of September saying no information to suspect that Benghazi was a pre-planned attack. That same day, privately, you have a State Department official in an email saying it's a well-planned attack. So you couldn't be further apart than those two things. Pre-planned, not at all. Well, I mean, you couldn't be farther apart. So we knew it. What we also didn't know is how invested they were in this policy. You know, Libya was supposed to be, Laura, this was supposed to be the crown jewel of how the Obama administration, the Clinton State Department foreign policy works. You can oust a dictator. You're helping with the Arab Spring. You do it without putting boots on the ground. This was such a big moment. A couple days after Gaddafi is gone, a year before the attack, Sidney Blumenthal sends an email to the secretary, and he says in the email, he says, "This is a big moment for you. You are vindicated," because remember, this was her policy. Vindicated is the key word. This was your policy to push for this. He said, "Don't wait. Help Cleo now." Cleo is the goddess of history. So this was so big. This is such a part of their legacy that she's on the same side as the goddess of history, for goodness sake. And so they were committed to staying there even though the security situation was so bad that one diplomatic security agent said, Benghazi is a suicide mission. Everybody there is going to die. That's how bad it was, but they were committed to staying there. And then, of course, we get a terrorist attack on September 11, 2012, and they're 56 days before the election.
I was just going to get into that. Yeah, and so let's remind everybody where we were in terms of the election at that time. Now, there was no point where Mitt Romney was ahead, that's for sure. However, both the Benghazi attack occurred on September 11th of 2008, and the scandal came out about General Petraeus, which was kind of delayed until after the election. There were two big things that might have had an effect on the election, but it certainly wouldn't have been great for the Obama narrative to concede that indeed the administration did not fortify or pull out of the compound and of our resources there, and in fact turned a blind eye to requests for more fortification and weapons, which I know is also in the report. That is a bad narrative on top of the, of course, just a terrorist attack and the ambassador dead. That's just a terrible narrative to them. So they had to come up with an Islamophobic narrative, much like they're doing in Orlando, I might add. I think Orlando response and Benghazi response has some kind of thread between them.
No, great point. Remember the context, Laura. You're exactly right what you described. But just a couple days prior to the attack in Benghazi, you had Joe Biden who said, GM's alive, Bin Laden's dead. You had the president saying Al-Qaeda's on the run, and then you have a terrorist attack. And as you point out, it's 56 days before an election. Their legacy is on the line because Libya is supposed to be the example of how foreign policy works in the Democrat administration. And as Mr. Blumenthal indicated, you got the goddess of history looking over your shoulder, so you got to mislead the American people, and that's what they did. They did it for political reasons. And that's not Jim Jordan's talking politics. That's what the facts say. When Susan Rice goes on TV a few days after the attack and goes and talks about the video as the cause, the next day, the experts at the State Department, people in the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau, people who look at the Middle East and study it, they said this: Rice was off the reservation on this one. The next person says off the reservation on 5 networks. And the third person in the email chain says the White House very worried about the politics. This was all they're doing. So, of course, that's what drove this thing. And frankly, I think politics drove the lack of response. The fact that 3 assets were put in place, and none of them ever get to Benghazi. Only one ever gets to Libya, and it arrives 23 hours later, and it goes to Tripoli. And that's because they were having people change out of their military uniforms into civilian clothes because they were always worried about political concerns. And that is a problem when you're trying to deal with a national crisis and save people's lives.
Isn't it interesting how many black people the Clintons have thrown under the bus? Susan Rice would have become the next Secretary of State, very likely, had she not gone on all these shows and ruined her reputation. And when Bill Clinton got into trouble with Monica Lewinsky, he called Vernon Jordan, his supposedly best friend, to have him get a job for her, didn't tell him he was having an affair with her. And Betty Curry, his secretary, was also thrown under the bus. He told her to retrieve gifts that were given. I'm Larry Elder.
Call the Larry Elder Show now at 888-971-SAVE.